All right, looks like most of you are already in. It is the top of the hour, so welcome to another edition of our ongoing webinar series here at the Rail Passengers Association. My name is Joe Aiello. I am the field coordinator. We have a really great topic, very in the news. I know a lot of things going on the Gulf Coast the last week or two, but what's going on in the Big Sky is extremely important. Especially in the landscape of the Amtrak map. So please remember to keep your microphones muted, your cameras off, and I will welcome our President and CEO, Jim Mathews, as he introduces our guests.
Okay, Joe, thank you. And I really am pleased that we've got so many folks showing up today to hear from our friend Dave Strohmaier. Dave and I met a few years ago. He came into our offices in DC as the commissioner of Missoula County, and he had this idea that, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could have this train? What could we do to get this done? And we have those kinds of conversations a lot in our office, and so we had a chat, and we talked about some things that were possible and how somebody was going to do an infrastructure bill. We just didn't know who or what shape it was going to take. And he and his group, there were several commissioners there and transportation folks. It was a good meeting. And they left. And I remember going to Sean Jeansgale, our VP for policy, and saying, these guys really have something. This is going to be, if they can get some traction going, they could actually have a project. So here we are a few short years later, and I think anyone who's been paying attention to passenger rail in this country knows that Dave Strohmaier has been kind of a force of nature, and really did lead the charge in creating the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority to try to bring this program to fruition, to connect Seattle and Chicago through southern Montana, through a lot of served communities on a line that used to exist and needs to exist again. Dave is a tremendous force in passenger rail, and the Big Sky project is a really cool project. And I've wanted for some time to share kind of the nuts and bolts behind that project with all of you. And I'm really thrilled that Dave has agreed to come and share what's happening with Big Sky, what they did, how they did it, and kind of what the next steps are going to be. Dave has really proven to be, as I said, a tremendous asset as we advance the case for passenger rail across the country. So please do welcome my friend Dave Strohmaier. Dave.
All right. Thanks so much, Jim. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to join you today. And thanks for everything that the Rail Passengers Association does and brings to this effort across the country. So we have a short overview video of the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority to share. I will talk a bit about the origin story of how we came to be. I know Jim has some interesting information to share relative to a economic study research note that we commissioned the Rail Passengers Association to conduct for us last year. And we will hopefully have plenty of time for questions from folks. So with that, Joe. We are embracing passenger rail as a way to bring this state, this region, and this nation back together again.
If there was passenger train service that provided intercity transport, it would be a tremendous boost to not just local businesses, but also local tourism between those locations.
It is a pleasure to be addressing so many folks who know how critical passenger rail is to Montana's economy, connectivity, and infrastructure. That's why I support your mission to expand passenger rail throughout the southern part of our state, because the more Montanans who are able to utilize these critical services, the more benefit we'll see down the tracks.
It's important we have the critical transportation infrastructure in place to help better connect our rural communities and improve transportation across Montana. It's also important that we have alternative modes of transportation and services for Montana travelers, as well as travelers coming to explore what the great state of Montana has to offer.
All right, thanks, Joe. So the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority, why do we exist? Well, as Jim mentioned earlier, it was back in 1979 that we last saw passenger rail service through the southern part of Montana, through the southern tier of our state. And for the last 42 years, we have been without passenger rail service. And as a result, I think there are many opportunities that we have foregone, whether that's economic, sustainability, transportation equity for my constituents. Next slide. And we exist because we are sick and tired of simply trying the same thing and expecting different results, because that will likely lead to the same results. I stumbled upon this photo here a week or two back. That's me back in 2009, so 13 years ago. We were at a farmer's market in Missoula, Montana, advocating for the return of the North Coast Hiawatha. This is in the era of PREA, for those of you who are familiar with federal law related to passenger rail. And we tried as a community, a bunch of isolated communities across the state of Montana, to lobby for passenger rail service. And you know what? We were not able to get that over the finish line. The efforts over the past 4 decades, at least in my state, relative to passenger rail advocacy have been led by advocates, passionate advocates, advocacy groups. But what we have lacked in our state has been the institutional infrastructure, the governance structure to motivate an effort like this forward over the years necessary and accomplishing the heavy lift that it is to get over the finish line. Next slide. So our mission is not unlike the mission of many other local governments or government entities. We are here to promote and further the health, safety, and economic prosperity of our region, of our constituents, in this case, through the lens of public transportation and rail specifically as a public transportation option. So recognizing that we have not been effective over the past several decades by simply advocating as individuals, as 501c3s, as isolated communities. I served on the Missoula City Council for a couple terms, and similarly, we put forward resolution after resolution urging members of Congress to restore the North Coast Hiawatha to no avail. So when I came on the Board of County Commissioners in Missoula County, Montana, one thing that was just an obvious, I guess, no-brainer as I looked at a map of our state is the one thing that is contiguous across our entire state is counties. So what could counties do? Again, coming at this from a grassroots level, what could counties do that isolated individuals, advocacy groups, isolated communities were not able to accomplish? So as we rooted around in state law here in Montana, what we found was a statute on the books dating from the early 1990s that authorizes counties, and in fact, only counties in the state of Montana, to jointly come together and by resolution establish a regional rail authority. We are, as a rail authority here in the state of Montana, a subdivision of state government, and this was what was authorized and is authorized in state law. As many of you probably know, there are states that have taken the initiative, their state legislatures have taken the initiative to establish rail commissions or authority-like entities. Here in Montana, sadly, our state legislature has not been that forward-thinking, so we were happy to find this law on the books and end up being the first such entity actually to come into existence under this statute. Next slide. So why else did we come into existence? Well, this is a pretty familiar map to many of you, in some cases a much maligned map for the fact that it doesn't offer as robust a vision as many would like in terms of long distance passenger rail. But the one thing that really leapt from us and jumped out at us from this map, next slide, is this region of the country in which I reside. People actually live here. This is not some vacant frontier territory. It's a region of the country that is arguably seriously underserved when it comes to passenger rail. You could probably pinpoint other areas on the map of the nation that are similarly not as well served as you would like, but certainly this greater Northwest region of the country which we're calling it has been traditionally underserved. And if you were to look at a map of rail service and rail connectivity over the past century, it's been a steady march of attrition. And our region certainly has been subject to that with the loss of the North Coast Hiawatha and the loss of the Pioneer Route, which also is something that we are advocating for the restoration of. What we're talking about is additive. We're not talking about a zero-sum game scenario where adding a long distance route somewhere means the subtraction of it somewhere else. The argument that we make is that this is additive, that adding connectivity across the nation is going to serve the overall system. It's going to create a true national network as opposed to the skeletal system that we have right now. So this is at the heart of the purpose and need of why we have pushed so hard to establish this authority, and beyond that, not simply establish a governmental entity related to rail, but also establish it with the goal in mind that we are going to see results on the ground. Next slide. So something you might have heard, and I guess going back to what Jim mentioned earlier, we met with Jim in RPA's offices in Washington, D.C. pre-pandemic. And we all know what happened in the spring, early spring of 2020. And invariably, I can't think of a time where I have not heard folks say, yeah, reestablishing passenger rail, restoring passenger rail might be a worthy cause, but it's just not quite the right time. We don't quite have the political will. We don't quite have the money or the dollars lined up. Well, friends, it is never a good time. And as a result of that, we figured no better time than the middle of a pandemic to kick this off, because if we don't start now, we are going to be completely caught with our pants down if and when, and now we know the when has already occurred, a major infrastructure bill crosses the finish line. So we formally established ourselves in November of 2020. I'll show you the map of the counties that pulled this together. We convened our first board meeting in January of last year, our first in-person meeting during a window of a bit of a lull during the pandemic in August of last year. We adopted our first budget last year, and we also went on to work with our U.S. Senator John Tester, who is on the Senate Commerce Committee, to introduce what became Section 22214 of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which will really provide the groundwork and the foundation to reestablish and to initially study the restoration of discontinued Amtrak routes. Next slide. So much of 2020 during the height of the pandemic was taken up by outreach to counties across Montana. So you may not be that familiar with the geography of Montana, but we are over 600 miles across the state of Montana, from Idaho to North Dakota. So it's no small piece of real estate that we're talking about here. By November of 2020, we had reached the point where we had determined we have enough of a critical mass of counties who are willing to come together and establish this rail authority to let's just do it. And that's exactly what we did. The statute is broad enough that counties do not need to be contiguous, hence you see some gaps in the map. And I should say the impetus for this state statute back in the early 1990s had less to do with passenger rail than it did with making sure that if you see up in that far northeast corner of the state of Montana, some of those spur rail lines that were in jeopardy of just going away and jeopardizing the economy of those agricultural communities, this statute was brought into reality and into existence to provide counties, local government, a mechanism to not just be a rail authority and play the role that we are as a broker between federal government, state government, host railroads, Amtrak, and other interests, but you could actually, under this statute, be a bona fide railroad. That's not what we're about, but the statute's written broadly enough to allow that. And also, thankfully, it's written broadly enough to allow us to do what we are doing now, to focus on passenger rail. What you'll also see on the map here, and the dark colored counties are ones that were the initial founding members. Lighter colored counties were the ones that were offered an opportunity to join the authority, though light white color counties are outside of the rail corridors in question. We wanted to embrace those counties through which passenger rail existed in 1979 by way of the North Coast Hiawatha, or also those counties, and this is taking an expansive vision of what we're about, those parts of the state that once saw passenger rail service predating Amtrak that connected Denver to Billings or Salt Lake City up to Butte, Montana, and points beyond. There's a couple other configurations in the map here that reflect potential alternatives in routing yet to be determined. But the main east-west route, that is the North Coast Hiawatha, that would continue to the east to Chicago or to the west to Seattle. Obviously, the Empire Builder is the bright blue line to the north. And one of the things that folks might be wondering or poised to ask, and I will preemptively answer it for you, is, does this mean that if we add passenger rail service to the most populous southern tier of Montana, that means the demise of the Empire Builder? The answer, absolutely not. We have more than one interstate highway in the state of Montana. We have more than one airport in the state of Montana. So similarly, adding additional connectivity via passenger rail is an opportunity to connect our nation and knit our state and nation and region together again. Next slide. So over the course of the last year, after the founding of the authority, we added 5 new counties. So we are now up to 17 counties. We're continuing our outreach with other counties that are still on the fence as to whether or not to join the authority. Each member county gets to appoint one director to our board of directors. And again, we are a governmental unit. We are a subdivision of state government. And we also have ex officio board member positions for Amtrak, for the tribal nations through which this corridor would pass. And in Montana, that means CS Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, the Crow Nation, and the Northern Cheyenne tribe. And we intend fully to light up every one of these counties that are currently just merely light green into dark green to be members of this authority. While our focus is currently on the state of Montana, our vision is much broader than that. And in fact, we can only accomplish our more localized vision if we have that more expansive vision. The other piece that I'll just mention, and this is maybe if there's anything else that you take away from today, I would want it to be this. If you look at these counties on the map, if you're at all familiar with the state of Montana, much of the geography that we're looking at is highly rural, deeply conservative politically. And so what we have cobbled together here is a collection of counties that cross political, ideological, urban, rural divides around this one issue, convening around this one issue of passenger rail, seeing its importance for economic vitality, seeing its importance for adding equity to the transportation palette of our constituents. And what this tells me is that in this time of deeply divided politics that we see splashed on our TV screens every single day, in this period of divisiveness, of rancor, we can still come together as a state, as a nation, and endeavor to accomplish big things. And this is exactly what we're about here. Next slide. So what might this mean in concrete terms? Painting a very vivid picture of what this might mean on the ground. So let me just point out a couple of quick examples. Bozeman, Montana. So it's a thriving community. It's an expensive place to live these days, but it's a thriving community. And what you see is the old passenger rail depot in Bozeman, Montana, that is currently a palette for graffiti artists, but it's immediately adjoining one of the most bustling areas of Bozeman, Montana. It's a area of technological and financial sector growth. It's a lovely area to meet and hang out in, and it would certainly be enhanced through transit-oriented development of revitalizing this train depot. Next slide. So kind of on the other end of the spectrum, not so much a graffiti palette, but a beautifully restored and active train station in Livingston, Montana, which is one of the gateways to Yellowstone National Park. We see this as yet another opportunity. Even though it's a vital place in the community today, it can even be a greater point of attraction, point of interest, point of vitality if we add passenger rail back to the transportation portfolio of Park County and specifically of Livingston, Montana. Next slide. So what Jim Mathews will talk about in just a moment, and I'm not going to belabor this right now, is the potential and the projected economic benefits to this line, the North Coast Hiawatha route. What we are looking at here are projected startup returns on investment and what I would characterize as a conservative estimate. Too often, as probably many, if not all of you know, the focus when it comes to adding passenger rail back into our transportation portfolio in communities that currently lack passenger rail is a fixation on the question of how much is it going to cost, yet far too little emphasis is given to what is the return on that investment to communities. And that's what we want to and have been about in our work, trying to recalibrate that discussion. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier that even though the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority, as a subdivision of state government in the state of Montana, as a taxing jurisdiction, as a body that's focused on restoring passenger rail to the southern tier of Montana, we cannot accomplish our efforts without a greater regional vision. And that's why we've teamed up with interest groups, with interested parties, state organizations, advocacy groups across this entire greater Northwest region to do outreach and to get the message across that only by working together can we accomplish something as big as this. So what you're seeing on the map here are counties, municipalities, tribal nations that we've done outreach to, following basically the North Coast Hiawatha route from east to west. But also, if you look at some of the concentration in our outreach efforts, it follows the Pioneer route in the state of Utah, Idaho, Oregon, and also looking ahead aspirationally to what passenger rail might be in the future. So hence you see dots down there in Colorado, along the Front Range, and Wyoming, and up even all the way to Alberta, because ultimately, wouldn't it be nice to be able to ride a train, to jump on a train in El Paso, Texas, and go all the way to Calgary along the Front Range? So let's not truncate our vision too much, which has been in many cases the default position that we've held, based on a spirit of and an attitude of scarcity. We can do better than that in the 21st century, and that's one of our main goals as a rail authority. Next slide. So something else, if you're out there thinking, okay, how have we been able to accomplish in a little over a year what arguably we've not been able to accomplish in 4 decades? Well, and as you go back to your home entities and organizations, don't underestimate the value of and the power of earned media. And so we've tried very hard to get our message out to media outlets. And as a result, no longer are we necessarily issuing press releases to members of the media, but they are coming to us interested in the story that we present and the model that we provide, not only for our region, but the entire nation. And for crying out loud, we've had interviews with folks out of Germany and Canada and Portugal, of all places. So there's something about our efforts here in the United States that's captured the imagination of folks, both nationally and even internationally. Next slide. So really quickly, what are some of the next steps for the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority, and what might you take away from this if you're looking at organizing similarly in your locale? So first off, we fully intend to utilize those provisions within the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, to study the expansion of passenger rail throughout our region. In our greater Northwest region, that means the Pioneer route, that means the North Coast Hiawatha. We are intent on looking at the possibility of utilizing a model that has played out in the southeastern United States by way of the Gulf Coast Working Group, to create a greater Northwest Working Group to assist the Secretary of Transportation and FRA in examining how it is that we're going to bring back this long distance service. We'll continue to collaborate with partners throughout the region, both nationally and internationally to the north, and also implement all of this by way of working with Congress, our state DOT, FRA, Amtrak, and the host railroads. Our main host railroad that we're going to be working with is going to be Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and we have a pretty good working relationship with them right now and intend fully to build upon that going into the future. Next slide. So if anything that I just described has any appeal to you as far as a possible mechanism to both institutionalize your passenger rail advocacy efforts and move it farther down the tracks, as it were, a fundamental question to ask is, do you in your state, your respective state, have the statutory authority to do what we have done in Montana? If you don't, I'm happy, reach out to me or the Rail Authority general inbox. happy to provide you an example of what our state law looks like in Montana. If I was to do it over again, there might be some tweaks I would make to that, but I have no desire to open up that can of worms with our state legislature. So I would be happy to show you what we have and provide you some insight into how that might even be made better in your context. If you can do it, think cross-jurisdictionally, cross-boundary, multi-jurisdictionally, regionally, nationally, and even internationally. Be bold. Again, we have, and with all due respect to my friends at Amtrak, we have for too long lived in a place of scarcity and have our imagination and creativity has atrophied in the process. So how can we shake loose from that kind of stupor that we've been in and think bold and big again? And what we're talking about is exactly that. Stay focused. You'll run into obstacles. You'll run into, and probably have, recalcitrant legislators, bureaucrats who tend to default to the answer no, or to put it not particularly delicately, well-meaning but circular firing squad passenger rail advocates. Sometimes we can be our worst enemies in bickering about minutia and failing to see the big vision, losing sight of the forest for the trees. Work through that. It's going to be a seeming obstacle, but working in local government, I can say that what frustrates me the most is when our default position is no, rather than looking at ways to remove obstacles and get to yes. So keeping that positive energy, staying positive in the process is important. And coming full circle to what I had mentioned earlier, this passenger rail, restoration of passenger rail, strengthening of the national network, our national long distance network. I'm not just talking about state supported corridors. I'm talking about a robust national network. This is something that we can do. It has bipartisan support, and let's not lose sight of that. So thank you so much. Next slide. Okay. Check us out at our website, bigskyrail.org. Something I would like to get on all of your collective radar screens. August 22nd and 23rd, we will be having a regional rail conference, the Greater Northwest Region Passenger Rail Summit in Billings, Montana. More information to come on that. We'll have announcements on our website. We'll be pushing it out through social media. I'd like to extend an invitation to any and all of you to join us for that, because again, what we're working on right here in Montana in this Greater Northwest region is not simply a thing unto itself. We really do want to be a model of and a catalyst for this effort across the entire nation. So check us out on our social media outlets. And with that, I will pass it off to Jim Mathews, who can talk a little bit about the research note.
Thanks, Dave. I hope you guys can see why I'm so excited about the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority and the work that they're doing, because it really is impressive. I want to take everyone through a very, very brief high-level overview of the work that we did for Big Sky to kind of characterize the potential gains here from doing this service. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the bottom line up front. What we found in our work was that our initial assessment is that restoring the North Coast Hiawatha as a daily service would, as Dave mentioned, generate, we think, around $271 million a year in economic benefits to the 7 states that are served. And we think it would be roughly $68 million a year to operate. 426,000 passengers is what we came up with as an annual ridership figure, including perhaps as many as 29,000 new passengers who would not otherwise travel at all using any travel mode if the train did not exist. But let's get into this in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. We looked at several categories here. We looked at visitor spending. We looked at reduced pollution. We looked at reduced crash fatalities, travel costs versus other modes. We also looked at the not just the savings element, but the additional value added that is generated. What I'd like to do is, before we get too far into this, let's talk briefly about sort of the philosophy underpinning the model, because all these numbers, it's a flurry of numbers, but the reality is actually fairly simple. If you think about it, if you imagine the last time you took a train trip, you get off the train, you stay for maybe 2 or 3 days, and what do? You go to a bar, you go to a restaurant, you go to a hotel, or you go to an Airbnb. You buy a few things, you buy some meals, you buy some trinkets, maybe you buy some groceries to keep if you're going to stay for a little longer. Maybe you buy some materials for a business meeting that you're going to be doing. Maybe you rent a car. But all of those things are examples of you leaving money behind because you took that trip. Where you leave that money behind is crucial, because when you do that, you support the people that work in those establishments, and they in turn pay their rent, pay their mortgage, raise their kids, keep the community strong, pay their taxes. So all of this money continues to ripple through the economy. You can follow with our modeling, you can follow the flow of that money through the economy, and you can see how many jobs it creates, how many additional tax dollars it creates, and so forth. And so that's really what this economic benefits model does. Next slide, please. So we looked at this to really get at a high level a sense of the overall benefit. And new labor income is a very big piece of this. So these are jobs that are created and sustained, not from necessarily even from constructing the service, but from creating services that will take care of passengers and their needs in the communities that are served. You saw some of the pictures that Dave showed you of hotels, restaurants, station areas. These are all places that will become busier, more lively with the addition of those travelers. And they're not all tourists. Some of them are, but not all of them are. And when you do that, you create jobs that are permanent, and those people in turn keep their money in the economy circulating within the community itself. Next slide, please. So I want to take everybody through what we studied. We looked at 4 initial service scenarios, and in consultation with Big Sky, the decision was made to only model one of those scenarios. The other 3 could be modeled later, and we're hoping to do that. But we looked at 602 variables in 43 counties in which Big Sky suggested that stations could be located. And that was Washington, Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. We did not model stops in Mineral, Powell, Deer Lodge, and Jefferson, but we could do that. And that's definitely in the mix. Next slide, please. So the way this works is, again, at a very high level, we take a given level of ridership, and from that ridership, we're able to derive the throughput of the train and the effect on the economy at large. This is not about alignments. This is not about the construction right away. This is not about signaling. This is simply saying that at a given level of ridership, what could be the economic activity that we would expect to see going along with that. So we looked at county populations and the counties that would be served. We looked at income data in those counties, and we looked at ridership behavior. We've been looking at these kinds of characteristics throughout the Amtrak system since really in an intense way since 2016, really trying to understand the relationship between the characteristics of a given county and the Amtrak ridership associated with that county. So we looked at the Empire Builder, the Sunset Limited, and the Texas Eagle, and we looked at the characteristics of those counties in terms of their demographics and population and income, so forth, and we used that as an overlay to understand what that might look like for a service like the North Coast ridership. Then what we did was we took the result of that number and we compared it to Amtrak's PIP study to see if they were wildly different or a little different and they were in the ballpark. Our ridership estimate was higher, but not drastically so. It wasn't like it was triple or quadruple what Amtrak had come up with. So we felt confident in our ridership figure based on the relationship that we'd established between those county characteristics and ridership patterns on the Empire Builder, the Sunset Limited, and the Texas Eagle. We felt like we had established a pretty good relationship between those numbers. And one of the things that comes clear in all of our work is that most rural counties are outsized users of passenger rail. They generate multiples of population for ridership. So a lot of people will say, well, how can this little county produce so many riders? Because it's true throughout the Amtrak system. Wherever you look, these small counties and smaller population areas are outsized users of trains, and they tend to produce annual trips that are multiples of their population rather than fractions of their population, as you might see in a place like Chicago or Philadelphia or New York or so forth. Next slide, please. So we started with our ridership figure, and then we looked at lodging, restaurants, shopping, entertainment, local travel, the amount of money that would be spent statewide. We looked at the savings to passengers by using rail relative to the cost of other travel modes. We looked at avoiding vehicle miles traveled. Anyone who's involved in local government will tell you that one of the biggest drains on a local tax base, on local government, is road repair, potholes, and reducing vehicle miles traveled reduces the wear and tear on those roads and reduces the amount of money you're going to have to spend to maintain those roads. We also see savings in reduced highway fatalities. All of this was built into a model that we co-developed in 2017 with the University of Southern Mississippi's Trent Lott Center. That effort was led by a professor of engineering and with a specialty in transportation. Next slide, please. Then we take the outputs of our model, which we developed with the Trent Lott Center, and we feed those outputs into a second level modeling. And this is an off-the-shelf tool called IMPLAN. Now, IMPLAN is pretty much the standard now in modeling socioeconomic benefits. It's used by universities, by governments, by the federal government. It was first used by the Forest Service, very widely accepted. And so what this does is it takes that direct benefit that we were able to calculate using our model, and it identifies the spending that enters the economy from the rail service and then traces the flow of that money through the other parts of the economy. And so you're actually chasing the velocity of the money through the rest of the economy. And that's really a key thing to understand, that we take a direct benefit and then we use the IMPLAN piece to show the larger benefit as that spreads throughout the economy. Next slide, please. So here's what we did not do. We didn't look at all four scenarios. And we hope to come back to that, but we haven't done it yet. Here's something else we did not do. We did not conduct a full operations analysis. This was not an EIS, an environmental impact study. This was not an operational analysis. This wasn't about timetables or scheduling or crew basing options or rights of way or alignments or signaling. None of those things were part of this study. That was by design. That was not a mistake. That was by design, because this is a large sort of macro look at, for a given level of ridership, is this worth taking a look at? And if the ridership is in the ballpark of reasonable, this looks like a decent number, and this looks like it's something worth studying, and that's what we were able to come up with. We would obviously want to adjust for particular destination characteristics in a subsequent study. If you look at a gateway to a national park, for example, that's going to attract a different level of ridership. We would want to make that kind of adjustment. The presence of a veterans hospital, that makes a big difference in the ridership. We would want to make those kinds of adjustments. But for the purposes of this work, we wanted to see that if we could inject a certain number of riders onto this route based on history, based on demographic characteristics, and based on Amtrak's own work, would this be worth pursuing? And the answer is pretty clearly yes. Next slide, please. So as I said, we did not determine specific alignments. We also didn't independently verify the capital spending. We really didn't include the capital piece in this study. One of the reasons we say that this is very conservative and that this undercounts the economic benefit is precisely because all we're looking at is what does this train do for the economy year in and year out once it's reached its steady state. This doesn't look at what you're going to need to do to improve the right-of-way, add signaling, add station work, add platforms, all the other capital investments that would be required to bring this into being. And all of those things have the same effects as any other kind of spending. So just as we talked earlier about a person visiting the town, spending money in the grocery store, spending money in the bar, spending money in the restaurant, the construction workers are going to do the same thing. They're also going to buy supplies. They're going to import those supplies. All of these things in turn will generate further income. So a 5 to 10 year capital program would tremendously increase the value of this project to the economies at large. We didn't model that. We could, but that was not the task at hand, and so we didn't do that. Next slide, please. So again, just to summarize, we found benefits for all of the states. You can see here in the table, and you can see that very roughly $271 million a year of benefit to the served states in various categories. The labor income and value added pieces are key. Those are all generated by the fact of the train's existence, and that comes from our in-plan modeling. So this really shows you why it's worthwhile to look at those second and third order effects as the money flows through the economy and it is stimulative to the rest of the economy. So that was really the purpose of this model. And you know, I think that even this 271 million is probably conservative. I think the ridership figure could probably be higher if we're able to refine it. And obviously, we think with the addition of the capital work, a 5 to 10 year capital program, you could easily see much more money than this generated for the economies of the 7 states concerned. Next slide. I do want to touch on this briefly. Lodging, restaurants, entertainment, shopping, local transportation. This was about $4.8 million. Why is this number relatively small compared to the $271 million that we have overall? That's because a lot of this is just measuring the new money from tourism, the increment. So what you're seeing here is not only would we generate the other figures, but this is $4.8 million of money that if we didn't do a train would not exist at all in any form. And so this was a kind of drill down into the fraction of people who would not travel at all if this train did not exist. Next slide. So we estimate that this is about 5 to 7% of ridership at any given station. Those are the folks who, if there was no train, they just wouldn't go anywhere. Now, this has been misinterpreted in some places as suggesting that the other money that we're counting is already being spent. No, it's not, because I don't know if you've been out there lately, but there's no train running on that route. None of this is being spent. But what we're saying is that some of this would happen in some other way if it were available. But of that percentage, 5 to 7% of those people are people who we are coaxing out of their couches who would never be out at all if this train didn't exist. Next slide. Tax returns. This is an interesting piece that a lot of people overlook, but this is going to generate sales tax receipts. It's going to generate tax receipts on, depending on the jurisdiction. Not all the jurisdictions have real estate taxes, but some of them do. Some of this is going to result in federal income tax on the wages of the people whose jobs are supported. So all of this kind of, again, ripples through the economy, and you come up with about $3.5 million a year in additional annual tax revenues created by the existence of this service across the states served. Next slide. So there's another piece of this, which is stimulating taxes on transactions between businesses. We did not model all of this, as I said. But if you begin to sort of think through what happens when you start a capital program and you have a lot of business to business transactions, whether it's for supplies or equipment or subcontracting or so forth, all of those will in turn generate tax revenues as well. So this is also offsetting revenue. Next slide, please. And this is the ridership. And like any model, these are more about order of magnitude than they are about precision. I wouldn't get hung up on the 58,956 in Montana instead of 58,942. These are orders of magnitude numbers, but the 426 compares pretty reasonably with if we had started this service in 2009 under Amtrak's original PIP plan, and we had grown it at the rate that Amtrak said it would grow, it would have come out by now to be somewhere around 380,000. So this is in the ballpark of previous studies. This is not a wildly unreasonable number. Next slide, please. We think that ridership diversion is likely to be minimal. There will be a handful of people, sure, who might come off the builder and take this train instead. However, it always is stimulative. Everywhere we look around the country, when you add this kind of service, it tends to be more like when you add a lane of highway and the traffic grows to fill the lane. We see the same phenomenon in new services on trains. It tends not to divert. It is more of a stimulative device, and you wind up developing additional need for additional trips. And I see in the chat, scheduling is important. Well, yes, it is. I'm going to go back to, this was not an operations analysis. This is an economic screening. And the economic screening suggests that there is something very valuable here. The next step, obviously, is to do something more in depth, to look at the scheduling, because ask anybody in Cleveland, Ohio, whether the schedule of the train drives the level of ridership on that train. I think we all know the answer to that. So yes, the scheduling is going to be very important. Next slide, please. Our VMT, our vehicle miles traveled savings, they're extremely conservative. We chose not to use the DOT figure of $11.7 million per life saved. If we had used that figure and applied that in our model to the level of fatalities that are projected, we would have seen probably 4 or 5 times the economic benefit generated just through the avoidance of road fatalities. In order to keep the model conservative, we chose not to use that figure. We will probably here in the next couple of months update our model to use the new DOT figure and adjust accordingly. Next slide, please. So I'm trying to go through this fairly quickly so that we had time for questions, especially for Dave. I have gone around the country giving speeches to folks who want to do what Dave has done. And they always ask me the same question. So now that we have Dave here with us, I would love it if people had the opportunity to actually ask Dave how he did what he has done. But I think you can see this is a very impressive project and it got done very quickly. So I guess we're ready to take questions. Joe, do you have, or Sean, do you have questions teed up for us?
I was going through the chat. I know Sean had a couple questions. I'm not sure if David already answered them throughout his presentation. If Sean wanted to kind of pop on off mute and.
Yeah, I don't want to monopolize the time, and Dave actually did address a lot of the things that I had questions about. But I wondered if as we think about the FRA's request for information on the corridor identification study, one of the key questions they had is, what is the role of FRA in developing these service development plans? What is the role of Amtrak, and how should these plans be used in terms of creating either a pipeline of discrete projects that are kind of ready to go? They've had the environmental review done, some engineering work done and they're ready for federal funds, or should there be kind of a longer term horizon put in place? I was wondering, Dave, if you had any thoughts on that corridor identification program in relation to the Big Sky Rail Authority's work, and where you see the federal government specifically for a long distance route playing a role in helping you build out the horizon of work that needs to be done and work that could be funded by the federal government to get you where you want to go.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So we are in the process of thinking through what our response will look like to that RFI that just came out from US DOT and FRA. So I don't have a whole lot of specifics to share. In a more general sense, though, I did have conversations with FRA leadership last week and posed the question, is the long distance route that we're talking about, or really any long distance route that we're contemplating restoring across the nation, under the umbrella of this corridor identification program? And the answer is yes. So don't feel as if, and our original concern was, is that corridor identification program focused on what many folks have been fixated on for years, and that is state supported intercity corridors. And while that is the case, it's broader than that. So we will be answering and responding to the request for information based on the fact that yes, we want to take a kind of a belt and suspenders approach, in that of the other provisions in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that are specific to long distance, this is one that crosses over between shorter distance corridor intercity routes and long distance. We see this as the route that we are focused on as ultimately being funded and supported precisely like the other long distance routes in our national network. So I saw one question flash across the chat ever so briefly about multi-state buy-in. Well, yeah, that is a challenge if we're talking about these particularly more sparsely populated states having to pony up for the operation and the initial capital investment to get these long distance routes going. But that is not what we're talking about. Look to the empire builder in our case. Look to our interstate highway system. Local governments in the state of Montana are not paying for Interstate 90 that passes through our community. So we will be pushing forward on a truly robust approach to the national network and long distance routes as we respond to the RFI.
I think it's important to sort of, because we started to stray into a little bit of another issue here, and I think I want to bring this up if I can. You know, one of the concerns that's been raised is this idea that PREA from 2008 means you can't do this, that everything is frozen in time. There's a pretty robust debate about whether Section 201 actually does that. It is not necessarily a sure bet that it does. But in any event, the fact that FRA is actively studying this route, there are going to be studies on long distance restorations that will include things like the North Coast Hiawatha, like the Pioneer, and some others. So as long as it's in the study and FRA is doing it, we don't need to go through a lot of additional work to enable the restoration of these routes. These are going to be studied and racked and stacked along with any other route that's going to be studied. And I think that's really where the next useful conversation can land.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Jim, this is one of these issues that I think we can get wrapped around the axle of and be so worried that we can't even be doing what we're doing unless we amend the 2009 piece of legislation. And the fact of the matter is Congress has spoken and has said through the bipartisan infrastructure law, do this. So that is what will happen.
Yeah, and I think
I would
go ahead, Sean. Sorry.
I was going to add, because Dan Mitzel asked in the chat, what is political strategy? Section 201 prohibits additions. That is not my reading. I don't think it provides any clear prohibition in adding long distance routes. It is also true that it doesn't provide any defined mechanism by which you could add it. And so there has to be some sort of sui generis agreement put in place. But Dave's point is the key one, which is Congress says, this is what we want. We want the study to identify funding options. And one of those options could be amend Amtrak's national network account to include these routes. And that it's a political question, not a technical, legal, statutory one.
Another thing that seems to have popped up in the chat, and I think I'm usurping Joe's role here as the moderator grabbing the chat. But I do hope that between Dave and I, we've addressed the idea that states would be responsible for funding a long distance route. That's not the case. That's not what this is. That's not what this says. So we need to not go down that road. Another question that I saw in here, and Joe, I don't know if this was one that you were teeing up for us or not, but it is an interesting conversation, the BNSF versus the, since they've taken over the MRL. I personally suspect that's probably good news for this project, but Dave, I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, I'll be happy to respond to that. So, well, it's always been the case that we've had a decent working relationship with Montana Rail Link. The termination of the lease, which is a long-term lease from BNSF to Montana Rail Link, has if anything, I think positive benefits and positions ourselves well for the future, insofar as Burlington Northern Santa Fe is well versed in the world of passenger rail and passenger rail operating on their network and system. Not so much with Montana Rail Link. They came into existence post 1979, so passenger rail has really not been within their wheelhouse. And I can also say that we've had a number of conversations just since the news broke about the early termination of the lease with MRL. We've had a number of conversations with Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and are extremely optimistic that we'll be able to go down a path of partnership, and not simply. This is another thing we sometimes get hung up on. Is how can we just avoid harming one another? Is setting the bar so low, and what I've tried to make clear to our partners with BNSF is we can do better than that. We can find win-win solutions. What benefits passenger rail will certainly benefit freight operations and vice versa. So let's work together and figure out a way for there to be synergy, not just kind of oppositional sort of rancor, which to some extent is what we're seeing play out in the Gulf Coast right now.
So, Joe, do you have any other? We've just completely steamrollered you today. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. It's okay. The question about MRL actually has come up in chat a couple of times, and actually was going to be my first question to tee up. I know that we are already at the top of the hour, but there are a couple of good questions I did want to get to. So if Dave, you can stick around for a couple more minutes. Question from Henry, as someone from Cincinnati, and actually this was kind of mentioned earlier about, as you mentioned, Jim, about Cleveland. Someone from Cincinnati, it is rough having 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. trains when most of our buses stop at midnight in the city. Any idea, Dave, what regional connectivity could be like? And like you had some great pictures of some great towns where the train's going to be in Montana, but anything that you guys already planned for how it'll connect regionally?
No, unfortunately, I can't give you that level of detail right now. It goes without saying that it's particularly through what I consider a gorgeous region of the country in the northern Rockies of Montana. It would be a shame if you were rolling through in the middle of the night and can't take any of that in. But having said that, there's a lot more work yet to be done in terms of what does the operation of this system look like? And what I want folks to shake free from is simply being bound to what existed when this route ceased to exist in 1979. Free our minds from what existed in the past and maybe what didn't work all that well in the past, which may have tainted some folks' view of what might be in the future. Let's look at this in a way that we can be as creative as possible, create a system that works for us in the 21st century. So a lot more yet to come, but that's as good as I can do right now.
Actually, another question for you, Dave. Kind of in a more kind of multi-state regional idea. Question from Dan Mitchell, another one from earlier in the chat. Has North Dakota or the southern tier counties of North Dakota, how evolved have they been?
Oh, I love that one. So let me see here. Yes, so we've done extensive outreach through southern North Dakota. City of Medora, Dickinson Convention and Visitors Bureau, Stark County, North Dakota Commission has weighed in support. Bismarck Mandan Chamber of Commerce, City of Mandan, Burleigh County, Fargo Moorhead Metropolitan Council of Governments, and I might be missing a few, but yes, the answer is yes. We've done extensive outreach, and I think what we found in North Dakota and other places is there is a lot of latent interest and energy surrounding this, but for let's face it, 4 decades, some folks who are now supportive of the idea were not even born at that point in time when we last saw passenger rail service. Others, it's been so long that they've just lost heart that it could ever come to be. Hopefully our efforts here in Big Sky Country will help rejuvenate both folks' interest in this and also a sense of renewed hope that this might actually be possible.
Great. I did probably one last question, because I know there's been a lot of chats on the economic study. So this one goes to Jim. Just real quick from Jacob Adams. Are the economic benefits a net benefit after annual costs, or is this the gross benefit that you were talking about with all the numbers? Just to get kind of a clarifying question.
This is a gross benefit. This is a gross benefit.
All right. So I do want to wrap up. Actually, I have a question for Dave, if I could. I'll take my staff influence here. Quick question: is it true that out of everything on the Amtrak Connects map, you are the route most chosen by Oscar winners?
That absolutely is true. Go to our website. On the homepage of our website, you will see our very own music video with Academy Award-winning actor J.K. Simmons featured in the rendition of All Aboard Montana. So check it out.
Yeah, if you guys have not, and actually on YouTube, if you search All Aboard Montana, it is we did a lot of social media work on this. It is fantastic. Kind of like, came out of nowhere for a lot of people, but like I said, it is the route most chosen by Oscar winners and their brothers. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. For our show up what our next event is, but I want to thank Dave, Commissioner Strohmaier, and Jim for a fantastic presentation. I know we went a couple minutes over, but a lot of great questions, a lot of great information that came out of this. So thank you both for your presentations, but also what's next for us. And we've been talking about it before. We are in person. We are going to be live in person in DC end of next month, in 1 month. Rail Nation DC, our spring conference, Sunday, March 27th through Wednesday, March 30th. Please, registrations are open now for hotel and for the conference. Please go to railpassengers.org/spring2022 for all your information. Just a heads up, things as Jim has told it in a blog in the past, things have been a little bit more fluid. We're kicking off with an open board meeting on Sunday nights. Monday is going to be full of speakers and panels and some workshops, but our traditional day on the Hill is actually going to be Wednesday and not Tuesday, because we've heard a lot from people regionally, council member committees, that you really want more time for your business meeting. There's a lot of talk about, we haven't been in person in over 2 years, so we're going to give an entire day to those who are in attendance. So things are going to be moving around a little bit, but an agenda will be hitting you guys very soon. So please keep in contact and pay attention to that website. So we will see you all in March. Our webinars will be back sometime in April and May. So please enjoy yourselves, stay safe, be good, and we'll see you soon.